Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Frostwatch Station squatted on the ice like a defiant middle finger to the universe, all gunmetal gray and stubborn human engineering planted on a planet that really, truly, absolutely did not want anyone living on it. Valdris 9 was the kind of world that made Antarctica look like a beach resort, where the average temperature hovered around -80 Celsius, and that was on a good day. The kind of day when the wind only wanted to flay the skin off your bones instead of ripping your entire skeleton out through your throat. The station housed a mixed crew, because apparently someone in colonial administration thought it would be a fantastic idea to stick a bunch of different species together in a tin can surrounded by endless ice and see what happened. Spoiler alert, what happened was a lot of passive-aggressive notes about whose turn it was to clean the communal kitchen. But the Quilnari, well, they made it work. They always did. Pack species, the lot of them, wolf-like in all the ways that mattered, and a few ways that absolutely did not translate well to other species' understanding. 4 arms, thick silver-white fur that could insulate against vacuum if they really needed it to, and eyes that saw straight through your nonsense directly into your soul. They stood roughly 2 meters tall, moved with liquid grace, and had this unnerving habit of knowing exactly what you were feeling before you did. Captain Veshka ran the station with the kind of ironclad efficiency that made grown sentients check their duty rosters twice and show up early. She was older for a Quilnari, fur graying around her muzzle, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. When she walked through the corridors, junior crew members straightened their spines so fast you could hear vertebrae popping 3 sections over. Nuala was the opposite, young and jumpy, and forever convinced she was about to break something expensive. Engineering assistant, barely 2 cycles out of academy, and she had this adorable and slightly annoying tendency to apologize to inanimate objects when she bumped into them. Her fur was still the pure silver of youth, and her ears swiveled at every sound like she was trying to listen to 6 conversations at once. Brantul, the security chief, was a wall of muscle and scar tissue who spoke in grunts and meaningful silences. His fur was darker than most Quilnari, almost charcoal, and he had a bite mark on his left shoulder that he claimed came from a Zenthari war beast, but everyone suspected was actually from a particularly aggressive door malfunction. He took his job seriously in that special way that meant he'd already planned out exactly how to evacuate the station during 18 different apocalypse scenarios and was working on number 19. The station also housed a handful of other species, a Threllan botanist who spent all day talking to plants that refused to grow in the terrible soil, 2 Vun technicians who communicated exclusively in clicking sounds and maintained the life support systems, and 1 human. Just the one. Corporal Tam, logistics officer, who had been assigned to Frostwatch 11 months ago and had since become part of the furniture. Quiet, efficient, the kind of person who showed up exactly on time, did exactly what needed doing, and then disappeared back into whatever hole he lived in. The Quilnari barely noticed him most days. He was small by their standards, maybe 1.6 meters of compact muscle and 0 personality, with dark hair and darker eyes, and the kind of face that you forgot 5 seconds after looking at it. He did his job. He didn't complain. He didn't socialize much. He was, by all accounts, the least interesting person on a station full of interesting people. Which was fine, really, because Frostwatch had more important things to worry about than one forgettable human. Things like the weather. Valdris 9 had weather the way black holes had gravity. Overwhelming and inescapable, and absolutely ready to kill you if you gave it half a chance. The atmospheric monitoring system tracked 3 major storm systems at all times, gave them names like they were pets instead of planet-murdering monsters. And occasionally those storms decided to have babies that were somehow worse than their parents. Today, one of those babies was throwing a tantrum. The briefing room smelled like wet fur and recycled air, and the particular kind of tension that came right before everything went catastrophically wrong. Veshka stood at the display terminal, her 4 arms crossed in that way that meant she was thinking hard and not liking her conclusions. "Storm system approaching from the northern quadrant," she said, her voice that particular growling purr that made every word sound like both a statement and a threat. "Weather analysis predicts it will arrive in 8 hours. Wind speeds up to 120 kilometers per hour. Visibility near zero. Temperature drop of another 30 degrees. Nula's ears flattened against her skull. The Cubs! And there it was, the thing everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. The Cubs! 6 of them. Young Quilnari on their first cold training exercise, out in the ice canyons 2 kilometers from the station. It was tradition, see? Something about teaching the next generation to respect the ice and understand their limits, and a bunch of other cultural reasons that sounded great right up until there was a storm coming. "They're supervised remotely," Brantle rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Protocol says they return at first sign of weather change." "Protocol," Veshka repeated, and somehow made the word sound like a curse. "Pull them back now. I don't care if it's early. I don't care if it looks weak. Get them home." Nula's claws flew across the communication console, her movements quick and nervous. "Sending recall signal. They should acknowledge within 30 seconds and be back in under 20 minutes if they move fast." Everyone waited. 30 seconds passed. Nothing. "Boost the signal," Veshka ordered. Nula tried. Her ears went flat again. "Captain, the atmospheric interference is worse than predicted. The storm, it's moving faster than the model said. It's already between us and their position." Brantle moved to the terminal, shouldering Nula aside with surprising gentleness for someone his size. His claws clicked on the controls. He tried every frequency, every backup system, every trick he knew. The communication board remained silent. "Visual?" Veshka asked, though her tone said she already knew the answer. "Satellites are showing nothing but white," Nula whispered. "The storm front, it's already over them. Captain, the projected arrival time was wrong. It hit 6 hours early." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 30 degrees all on its own. Quilnari were pack species, family-oriented in ways that other races found almost incomprehensible. Cubs weren't just children. They were the future of the pack, protected by every adult, cherished by the entire community. Losing cubs was the worst thing that could happen to a pack, the kind of tragedy that echoed through generations. And 6 of them were out there, in a storm that would kill a fully grown adult in minutes. "Emergency retrieval," Brantle said flatly. "I'll take a team." "No?" Veshka's voice cracked like a whip. "Current conditions are a death sentence. You know this. I know this. We all know this." "Then we let them die?" Brantle's fur bristled, all 4 of his hands curling into fists. "We wait for the storm to pass, and then we recover what we can," Veshka said, and something in her voice broke just a little. "I will not sacrifice more of my pack on a suicide mission." The station AI, helpful as always, chose that moment to chime in with its analysis. "Current wind speed at target location, 218 kilometers per hour. Temperature, -109 Celsius with wind chill. Survival probability for unshielded Quilnari cubs, 2% and declining. 2%. The number hung in the air like a curse. Nuala made a sound, something between a whimper and a howl. Other Quilnari crew members had gathered at the doorway, drawn by some instinct that said the pack was in pain. Within minutes, the sound started, low and mournful, rising from every Quilnari throat in the station. The mourning howl, the sound a pack made when cubs were lost. It was a terrible sound, full of grief and rage and helplessness, and it echoed through the metal corridors like the station itself was crying. Veshka stood rigid, her jaw clenched, fighting against every instinct that screamed at her to run out into the storm anyway. Leadership meant making the hard choices. Leadership meant accepting that sometimes you couldn't save everyone. Leadership was, in that moment, the worst thing in the entire galaxy. The howling continued. Nuala had tears, freezing on her fur. Brantle stared at the communication console like he could will it to work through sheer rage. Other crew members joined in the mourning, their voices rising and falling in ancient patterns that spoke of loss and sorrow. Nobody noticed when Tam left the room. Nobody noticed when he walked past the security checkpoint and into the equipment bay. Nobody noticed when he started pulling on the heavy exosuit, the old Mark VI model that nobody used anymore, because it was bulky and slow and generally considered obsolete. Nobody noticed until it was far too late, until Tam was already gone, until the auxiliary airlock logged a cycle event, and Nuala, through her tears, happened to glance at the security feed and saw the timestamp. 18 minutes ago. The human had walked out into the storm, and nobody had even realized he was gone. Nuala stared at the security feed timestamp like it might change if she looked hard enough. It did not change. It sat there, smug and absolute, informing her that the auxiliary airlock had cycled 18 minutes and 32 seconds ago, and the only person unaccounted for was the human. "Captain," she said, her voice somehow both a whisper and a shout. "Captain, Tam is gone." The mourning howls stuttered, caught in throats mid-sound. Veshka spun around, all four arms suddenly tense. "What?" "The human. He went outside, 18 minutes ago." Nuala pulled up the feed, rewound it, showed them all the grainy footage of a figure in an exosuit, methodically checking seals, and then stepping into the airlock without hesitation, without pause, like he was just going out for a walk, instead of into literal frozen death. Brantle crossed the room in 2 strides, his eyes locked on the screen. "That's the Mark VI suit. Heavy model. Why would he take that?" "Why would he take anything?" Veshka snarled, slamming one fist against the console. "The human threw away his life for nothing. The cubs are already dead, and now we've lost him too." "Maybe he didn't know how bad it was," Nuala offered weakly. "Maybe he thought—" "Thought what?" "That he could skip through a killing storm and bring back cubs he barely knew existed?" Veshka's fur bristled along her spine. "Humans. They think they're invincible because they climbed to the top of one mediocre planet's food chain. They don't understand pack bonds. They don't understand sacrifice. He probably just got depressed and decided to end it dramatically." Brantle wasn't listening. He was pulling up Tam's equipment logs, checking what the human had taken. He grabbed the heavy suit, thermal packs, emergency beacon, medical supplies. His eyes narrowed. And he emptied the stimulant locker. "Stimulants?" Nuala's ears perked up. "Those are for extreme emergency use only. They're dangerous in cold environments. They can cause—" "It doesn't matter what they cause, because he's already dead," Veshka interrupted, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. She pulled up, the external monitors, the ones that were supposed to show the terrain around the station, but currently showed nothing except white static and screaming wind. Even if by some impossible miracle he made it 50 meters, the storm would have killed him by now. The other Quilnari crew members had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Someone asked what was happening. Someone else explained. The morning started again. Now, for a presumed 8th victim, even if that victim was just the weird, quiet human nobody really talked to. But here's the thing about assumptions. They're really only as good as the information backing them up. And the Quilnari were making assumptions based on what they knew about their own species and the handful of others they'd encountered. Humans, though, humans were still relatively new to the galactic stage, still full of surprises, still carrying around evolutionary baggage from a death world that made Valdris 9 look almost reasonable by comparison. See? The Quilnari evolved on a world with normal weather patterns and reasonable predators and social structures built around cooperation and community. Humans evolved on a planet that actively tried to murder them on a daily basis, where the apex predators were persistence hunters who would literally chase prey until it died of exhaustion, where sweat was a cooling system so efficient it let them run in heat that would kill most other species, where throwing spears with enough accuracy to bring down megafauna was just a Tuesday afternoon activity. Humans were endurance monsters wrapped in a thin package of social anxiety and bad decisions. And Tam? Tam had a file. If anyone had bothered to read it properly instead of just skimming for the relevant duty assignments, they would have found some interesting notes. Born in an Antarctic research station to parents who studied ice core samples and thought negative 60 degrees was brisk. Childhood spent learning to navigate whiteout conditions for fun. Military service with an engineering battalion that specialized in hostile environment operations. Decorated twice for actions that the file politely described as showing initiative beyond standard parameters, and less politely described as, "What the hell were you thinking, you absolute maniac?" There was a psychological evaluation in there too, one that noted Tam was unsuitable for frontline combat deployment due to excessive risk-taking behavior when others are in danger. Read that again. Unsuitable for human military combat because of excessive risk-taking. That was like being too loud for a rock concert or too spicy for a supernova. The file also noted that Tam had completed a 90-kilometer march through a blizzard while carrying a wounded squadmate and singing off-key the entire way to stay awake. The file mentioned cold resistance training, where Tam had simply outlasted the instructors. The file had a whole section on survival incidents that read less like a military record and more like a list of reasons why humans shouldn't be allowed off their planet unsupervised. Nobody had read the file that carefully, though, because Tam was just the logistics guy, and logistics guys were boring. Except Tam wasn't in logistics because he was boring. Tam was in logistics because Command had looked at his record and decided he needed a nice, quiet posting where he couldn't do anything crazy. Frostwatch Station was supposed to be that quiet posting. Oops! Outside, in the storm that was supposed to be impossible to survive, Tam was having what could generously be described as a moderate inconvenience, and what he would probably describe as a bit breezy. The Mark 6 exosuit was holding together, mostly, even though the wind was hitting it hard enough to dent the plating, and the temperature readout had stopped displaying numbers and started displaying a frowning face icon that meant, "You should be dead. Why aren't you dead?" The suit's heating system was working overtime, burning through power faster than recommended. But Tam had planned for that. He'd stuffed extra battery packs into every pocket and jury-rigged a charging loop from the suit's kinetic generators, which meant every step he took fed a little power back into the system. It wasn't efficient, but efficiency was for people who had time to worry about it. Tam did not have time. The Cubs were 2 kilometers out, probably huddled in whatever shelter they'd found, probably hypothermic by now, definitely terrified. 2 kilometers wasn't far. Humans had run marathons longer than that. Humans had walked from one continent to another just because they were curious what was over there. 2 kilometers was nothing. 2 kilometers through a storm that was actively trying to turn him into a popsicle, now that was slightly more interesting. The visibility was 0. The suit's instruments were glitching from the electromagnetic interference. The wind kept trying to pick him up and throw him into things. Tam ignored all of it and just kept walking, 1 foot in front of the other, counting steps, because that was what you did when you couldn't see and couldn't trust your instruments. Each step was a victory against physics. Each meter forward was another middle finger to entropy. Back at the station, they were watching his beacon signal. It kept flickering, cutting in and out as the storm interference played havoc with the transmission. But it was moving. Impossibly, stubbornly, the little dot on their screen kept advancing toward the Cubs' last known location. "How is he still moving?" Nuala whispered, her eyes locked on the display. Brantle checked the data. Suit telemetry shows external temperature at -115. Wind speed variable but averaging 210 kilometers per hour. He should have been blown away or frozen solid. "Maybe the suit is better than we thought," someone suggested. "The suit is 40 cycles old," Brantle countered. "It's held, together with spite and duct tape." Veshka watched the beacon, her expression unreadable. "How long has he been out there?" 2 hours and 16 minutes, Nuala said quietly. 2 hours, in conditions that should have killed him in 10 minutes. The Quilnari mourning had stopped. Now they were just watching, silent, as the impossible happened in real time on their sensors. The beacon reached the Cubs' last known coordinates. Then it vanished. The display showed nothing. No signal. No telemetry. Just empty static where the human had been. "Equipment failure," Brantle said. "Storm took out his transmitter." "Or the storm took out him," Veshka added, but her voice was quiet, uncertain. They waited. Minutes crawled by like wounded animals. The storm continued to rage outside, indifferent to the drama playing out in its midst. The crew stared at the empty screen, hoping for the signal to return, knowing it probably wouldn't. 3 more hours passed. The storm began to weaken, its fury gradually subsiding into mere catastrophic danger instead of instant death. The wind dropped below 100 kilometers per hour. Visibility improved from none whatsoever to slightly better than none whatsoever. Veshka began organizing recovery teams. They'd go out at first light, find what was left, bring everyone home. It was all they could do now, all they could ever do. Brantle coordinated equipment checks. Nuala updated the logs, marking 8 crew members as lost to the storm, her claws trembling as she entered Tam's name alongside the Cubs. The morning howls started again, softer now, weary and heartbroken. And then the proximity alarm went off. Auxiliary airlock. Something was outside, requesting entry. "Probably debris," Brantle muttered, but he pulled up the external camera anyway, because protocol was protocol even when your soul was shattered into pieces. The camera showed a figure, humanoid, covered in ice and snow, the exosuit cracked and frozen, faceplate spider-webbed with fractures, standing in front of the airlock like a ghost made of winter itself. And behind the figure, bundled in thermal wraps and emergency blankets, moving slightly, definitely alive, were 6 small shapes that could only be the Cubs. Nuala made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a scream. Veshka's jaw dropped open. Brantel just stared. The airlock cycled. The inner door opened. Tam stepped through, ice cracking off the exosuit with every movement, frost coating every surface, and behind him the 6 cubs stumbled into the warm air, crying and scared but unmistakably, impossibly, incredibly alive. Tam looked at the assembled crew, at their shocked faces, at Veshka's expression of complete disbelief. Then he smiled, a tired, broken thing that was somehow still smug, and said, "Found them," and collapsed. Chaos erupted in the airlock bay like someone had thrown a grenade into a library. All noise and movement and sudden activity where there had been stunned silence moments before. The cubs were crying, making those high-pitched distress calls that stabbed straight into every Quilnari's hindbrain and activated protocols written into their DNA. Within seconds, crew members were rushing forward, scooping up the small bundles, checking them over with shaking hands and desperate eyes. Tam hit the deck hard, the exosuit clanging against the metal floor with a sound like a bell being dropped off a building. The suit's systems finally gave up entirely, error lights flickering out one by one until the whole thing was just dead weight around him. "Medical team to airlock 3! Veshka's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, snapping everyone back into something resembling professional mode. "Now!" Brantel was already moving, his forearms surprisingly gentle as he started cracking open the exosuit's seals. The metal was frozen solid, ice welded into every joint and seam. He had to use a thermal torch just to get the chest plate loose. Nuala knelt beside the cubs, her claws flying over the medical scanner, checking vitals. "They're hypothermic but stable. Core temperatures low but rising. No major trauma visible." One of the cubs, a small female with silver fur matted with ice, looked up at Nuala with wide, terrified eyes. "Is Tam okay? He carried us. He promised we'd be okay. Is he okay?" And wasn't that just a knife to the heart? The fact that these cubs, who should have been focused entirely on their own survival, were worried about the human who'd saved them. Dr. Unwa arrived in a flutter of iridescent feathers and clicking efficiency, their bird-like species moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something with hollow bones. They carried medical bags in both wing claws and immediately began distributing warming packs and checking the cubs more thoroughly. "Get them to Medical Bay 1, Unwa ordered in their melodic voice that somehow managed to sound calm even in crisis. "Warm them slowly. Monitor for shock. They'll be fine, but I want continuous observation for the next 12 hours. The cubs were ushered away, still crying but alive, surrounded by adults who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Parents who had been preparing funerals were suddenly holding their children again, fur wet with tears that froze in the cold air, leaking from the airlock. That left Tam. Brantel finally got the exosuit open and immediately recoiled. Ancestors preserve us. The inside of the suit was a nightmare of improvised engineering and desperate measures. Tam had torn out half the internal components, the non-essential systems gutted and repurposed. Wiring hung loose where he'd ripped it free. The environmental controls were jury-rigged into something that barely resembled their original design. And wrapped around Tam's torso, constructed from suit insulation and heating elements and what looked like parts of the emergency rations packaging, were 6 small slings. He'd built a carrying system inside the suit. Built it while walking through a killing storm, somehow managing to engineer and navigate and survive all at the same time. Tam's actual physical state was worse. His skin was pale, lips blue, frost in his hair and eyebrows. The medical scanner Unwa waved over him screamed protest, numbers flashing red across the display. Core temperature 34.8 degrees, Unwa said clinically, though their feathers were puffed up in alarm. Severe hypothermia, frostbite on fingers and toes, possibly ears, elevated heart rate, signs of stimulant use, exhaustion, dehydration. They paused. He should be dead. He's human, Veshka said, like that explained anything. Maybe it did. Get him to Medical Bay 2, Unwa ordered. Warming protocols, IV fluids, cardiac monitoring, gentle rewarming only. We don't want to shock his system. Wait! Tam's voice was barely a whisper, cracked and rough. His eyes cracked open, unfocused. The little ones. Check them first. I'm fine. You are objectively not fine, Unwa replied. You're half frozen and completely insane. That's just baseline human, Tam muttered. Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp. They carried him to medical, and that's when Dr. Unwa started finding the really interesting bits. While setting up the warming blankets and IV lines, while monitoring Tam's vitals as his body slowly remembered what warmth felt like, Unwa discovered the full extent of what the human had done. The stimulants in his system were military-grade, the kind that came with warning labels about cardiac arrest and psychotic breaks. Tam had taken enough to keep a Quilnari warrior awake for 3 days straight, in freezing temperatures, where they should have accelerated his metabolism and killed him faster. Somehow they hadn't. The jury-rigged heating unit Unwa found in the wreckage of the exosuit was a work of desperate genius. Tam had cannibalized the suit's weapon charging system, the emergency beacon's power cell, and what appeared to be his own personal data pad, then wired them together into a heating array that had probably violated at least 9 safety regulations and somehow kept the Cubs from freezing. And the navigation. Oh, the navigation was the really wild part. Brantle pulled the suit's computer core, what was left of it, and tried to extract the route data. The navigation system had failed within 30 minutes of Tam leaving the station. GPS was dead. Compass was glitching. The terrain mapping software had crashed entirely. Tam had walked 4 kilometers through whiteout conditions, found 6 cubs in the ice canyons, and walked back, all without working instruments. How? Brantul asked the unconscious human, as if Tam might suddenly wake up and explain. How did you navigate? Veshka stood at the viewport in Medical Bay 2, watching Tam's chest rise and fall under the warming blankets, her 4 arms crossed in thought. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the cubs, being reunited with their families, joy and relief and disbelief, all mixing together into something that sounded like hope. Nuala approached quietly, her ears flat with exhaustion and emotion. Captain, I pulled the airlock footage. All of it. From when he left until he came back. And he took 3 minutes to check the suit seals. Then he just walked out. Didn't hesitate. Didn't seem afraid. Just went. Nuala's voice was small. Why would he do that? He had no pack bond with those cubs. He barely interacted with them. Most of the time, I don't think he even knew their names. Veshka was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the human who had done the impossible for reasons she couldn't quite understand. I don't know, she admitted finally. Human pack structures are different from ours. Weaker, we always thought. They don't have the biological imperatives we do, the instinctual bonds. Then why? Nuala pressed. Maybe that's the question we should ask him when he wakes up. If he wakes up, Unwa's expression said, though they were too professional to voice it out loud. But Tam did wake up, because humans were infuriatingly difficult to kill, and this one seemed particularly stubborn about it. It took 6 hours of careful rewarming, 2 bags of IV fluids, and enough monitoring equipment to outfit a small spacecraft, but eventually his eyes opened and focused on the ceiling of the medical bay with the expression of someone who was deeply annoyed to still be alive. "Cubs," his first word, rasped out through a throat raw from breathing frozen air. "Safe," Unwa said immediately, appearing beside the bed with that uncanny speed their species had. "All 6, hypothermic but recovering. No permanent damage. They're asking about you." Tam's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile if his face wasn't still half frozen. "Good. You, however, are considerably less safe," Unwa continued, their tone taking on a lecturing quality. "You have frostbite on all your fingers, 3 toes, and both ears. Your core temperature dropped to levels that should have stopped your heart. You ingested enough stimulants to kill most species, and apparently decided that was a reasonable life choice. Your navigation equipment failed, and you simply kept walking anyway. Would you care to explain any of this?" "Cubs needed help," Tam said, like that was the entire explanation. Maybe for him it was. Veshka chose that moment to enter the medical bay, and something in her expression made Tam try to sit up. He made it approximately 6 centimeters before his body informed him that was a terrible idea, and he should stop immediately. "Stay down," Veshka ordered, moving to stand beside the bed. "You've earned the right to be horizontal for a while." "Captain," Tam acknowledged, his voice still rough. "You saved 6 cubs who were not your pack," Veshka said, each word chosen carefully. "You risked your life, walked into certain death. For children you had no bond with. Why?" And there it was, the question that had been building since Tam walked back through that airlock. The thing every Quilnari needed to understand, because it didn't fit their framework of how the universe worked. Tam was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying Veshka's face like he was trying to figure out what answer she wanted. Then he seemed to decide honesty was easier than politics. "They were kids," he said simply. "Someone had to get them." "But why you?" Nuala had appeared in the doorway, unable to stay away, her curiosity overriding her nervousness. "You barely knew them. You had no obligation." "Didn't need to know them," Tam said, his brow furrowing like he was confused by the question. "They were in trouble. I could help. That's all that mattered." Brantel's voice came from behind Nuala, deeper and more thoughtful. "You had no pack bond, no biological imperative. You chose to risk death for cubs that meant nothing to you." "They weren't nothing," Tam said, and something in his tone was almost offended. "They were kids. That's everything." The Quilnari exchanged glances, trying to process this. Their pack bonds were biological, chemical, written into their brains by evolution. You protected your pack because you had to, because not protecting them was physically painful, because the instinct was stronger than thought. Humans didn't have that. Humans chose. Which somehow made it worse, made it more, made it into something that the Quilnari couldn't quite fit into their understanding of how altruism worked. Tom, oblivious to the existential crisis he was causing, looked at Veshka with those 2 calm eyes. "Did I do something wrong? Should I have asked permission first?" Veshka made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "No, Tam. You did something very, very right. You did something we thought was impossible." "Oh, good," Tam said, and closed his eyes. "Can I sleep now? I'm really tired." "Yes," Unwa said gently, adjusting the warming blankets. "Sleep. We'll talk more later." Tam was asleep in seconds, his breathing evening out into the deep rhythms of genuine rest. The Quilnari stood around his bed, watching the human who had done the impossible, simply because It needed doing. "We need to understand this," Veshka said quietly. "We need to understand him." "I already did some checking," Nuala admitted, pulling up her datapad. "I was curious, so I read his file. His actual file. All of it." She showed them the Antarctic childhood, the cold resistance training, the survival incidents that read like fiction, the psychological evaluation that deemed him too reckless for combat. And then she showed them something else, something she'd found in the station's access logs. "He's been studying our language," Nuala said, her voice wondering. "For months, learning about Quilnari culture, reading about our pack structures, our traditions. He even learned the morning songs." Brantle's ears went flat. "Why would he do that?" "And look, at this," Nuala continued, scrolling through more data. "He noted the Cubs' exercise schedule, made notes about cold weather protocols, ran simulations about storm responses." She looked up at them, her eyes wide. He was preparing. He was preparing for a disaster that might never happen, just in case. Veshka felt something shift in her chest, some understanding clicking into place. He planned to save cubs who might need saving, before he even knew them, before there was any danger, just in case. "That's insane," Brantle said. "That's human," Veshka corrected, staring at the sleeping logistics officer with new eyes. "That's what they are." Tam woke up the next day to find his medical bay had become something between a shrine and a petting zoo. The 6 cubs were piled on and around his bed, ignoring every protest from Dr. Unwa about proper patient recovery protocols. They'd decided Tam was the best pillow in the station and were not accepting counter-arguments. "They won't leave," Unwa said, somewhere between exasperated and amused. "I tried. Their parents tried. Physics tried. They're attached to you now." Tam looked down at the pile of silver fur and sleepy cubs, one of them drooling on his arm, and seemed profoundly uncomfortable with this development. "I'm really not good with kids." "You carried them 4 kilometers through a death storm," the small female cub mumbled into his shoulder. "You're stuck with us now." Veshka arrived with the entire pack leadership, which meant the medical bay suddenly felt very small and very crowded. She looked at the cub pile, at Tam's expression of quiet panic, and her muzzle twitched in what might have been amusement. "We need to talk," she said. "Officially." The cubs were gently peeled away, protesting the entire time, and ushered out by their parents, who kept stopping to touch Tam's shoulder or hand, little gestures of gratitude that seemed to make him more uncomfortable than the frostbite. When the room was finally clear except for the leadership, Veshka sat down beside the bed, her forearms relaxed, but her eyes serious. "Explain," she said simply. "Help us understand. You had no pack bond with those cubs. You barely knew their names. Why did you risk everything?" Tam was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to find words for something that didn't need words in his own head. "Where I'm from, we have this idea. It's not really complicated. If you can help and you don't, that's worse than not being able to help at all." "But the risk," Nuala interjected. "You could have died. You nearly did die." "Yeah," Tam agreed, like this was just a fact of life. "But they definitely would have died if I didn't try. Math wasn't hard on that one." Brantul leaned forward. "You said you used to do longer walks before breakfast. You were serious about that?" "Antarctic stations," Tam said with a shrug that he immediately regretted based on the wince that followed. "When I was growing up, 10-kilometer morning runs in -60 were just normal. Built character, my parents said. Mostly built really good cold tolerance and a deep hatred of ice." And yet you volunteered for a posting on an ice planet, Veshka noted. Seemed funny at the time, Tam admitted. Also, you know, orders and stuff. Your file says you're unsuitable for combat due to excessive risk-taking, Brantle said, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Care to explain that? Tam actually smiled at that, tired and a little sheepish. Turns out, Command doesn't like it when you go off mission to help civilians in a war zone. 3 times. Who knew? The Quilnari processed this. Their pack bonds were biological imperatives, chemical reactions they couldn't ignore even if they wanted to. Humans didn't have that excuse. Humans chose to run into danger, chose to help strangers, chose to risk everything for people they didn't even know. It was the choice that made it terrifying and beautiful all at once. In Quilnari culture, Veshka said slowly, we have a ceremony. It's called Pack Friend. It's the highest honor we can give to someone outside our species. It means you're considered family to all Quilnari, everywhere, forever. It's not something we give lightly. Tam looked uncomfortable again. That's really not necessary. I was just doing my job. Your job, Brantle said flatly, is inventory management. Well, Tam said, I brought back 6 living cubs. That's inventory. The Quilnari stared at him for a moment. Then Brantle started laughing, this deep, rumbling sound that shook his entire frame. Veshka's muzzle split into a genuine grin. Even Nuala giggled nervously. Your pack friend, Veshka said firmly. Accept it. We're having the ceremony whether you like it or not. Can I at least be conscious for it? We'll see how you behave. The ceremony happened a week later, after Tam could walk without limping too badly, and most of his frostbite had healed into interesting scars he'd definitely have to explain to people later. The entire Quilnari crew attended, which was most of the station, and they sang songs in their language that Tam had apparently learned enough of to follow along. They marked him with pack symbols, temporary ink that would fade but would always mean something. They declared him family in the old words and the new ones. The cubs sat in the front row and cheered so loud it echoed through the station corridors. Tam looked profoundly embarrassed by all of it, and also maybe a little pleased, in that way humans had, where they pretended they didn't care about belonging but absolutely did. Weeks passed. The station returned to normal operations. Tam went back to logistics, doing his quiet, competent thing, mostly being ignored by the non-Quilnari crew who still didn't quite understand what had happened. But the Quilnari understood. They watched the human who chose to be a hero without any biological reason forcing him, who prepared for disasters that might never come just in case someone needed him, who walked into death and walked back out carrying children like it was just another day at work. A new human ship arrived with supply runs and personnel transfers. The captain, a gruff woman with too many scars and not enough patience, met with Veshka to discuss logistics. "How's your crew handling the isolation?" she asked. "This posting is rough. Most species struggle." Veshka looked across the common area where Tam sat on the floor, surrounded by cubs who were teaching him some game involving complex rules and a lot of laughter. He was losing badly and seemed perfectly content with that. "We have a human," Veshka said simply. "We're fine." The captain followed her gaze, watched the scene for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that'll do it. They're good like that." And that was the thing, really. The thing the galaxy was still learning about humans. They weren't the strongest species, or the smartest, or the longest-lived. They didn't have pack bonds or hive minds or telepathic connections. They just had choice. And sometimes they chose to walk into storms. And sometimes they walked back out again, carrying everyone they could reach, because someone had to, and they were there, and that was enough. The cubs piled onto Tam, declaring victory in their game. He laughed, genuine and warm, and didn't even try to escape. Outside, snow fell on Valdris 9, gentle now, almost peaceful. The storm had passed. The pack was whole. And somewhere in the logistics office, Tam's file sat in the system, marked with a new commendation, though nobody would ever read it because logistics guys were boring. Except when they weren't. Except when they were human.